Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Bas and in this video I'm going to knit cables on my knitting machine. I'm going to knit it on this knitting machine, my Passap Duomatic 80 knitting machine. And cable knitting, I think, is very cool. Knitting cables does require a lot of hand manipulating, but the result is well worth it. And in this video I'm going to show you some tips and tricks for easier cable knitting on a knitting machine. To show you how I knit cables on this knitting machine, I'm going to knit a baby sweater. Kind of a small sweater, but you can size it up to your liking. Okay, let's start with the cables. This is my sample book with all different cables and cable patterns, a description of how the cables are worked. And whenever I want to knit cables, I'm going to look into my book to see what cables I like. And for this video I have chosen to start simple with this cable, because you can always make it more difficult when you get the hang of it. I want to knit my sweater in this beautiful cobalt blue yarn. It is 100% wool. It is a, it's considered a standard sock weight yarn over here, which means it is, this cone is 500 grams and it has 2100 meters. So that's basically a standard sock yarn. And I have knitted some swatches on different stitch sizes on my machine to see what I like, because it's all personal preference. And I chose a stitch size of 6 for this garment. And I've also tested my ribbing and my cable. And I like it, so I'm going to knit the sweater in this configuration. So, a baby sweater. Really straightforward, with sleeves and a cutout for the neck. And I'm going to knit it in blue yarn. And I want to knit 3 cables along the front of the sweater, like so. Okay, so how do you knit a sweater like this? It's a fairly basic and easy sweater. The back of the sweater is just a plain rectangle with ribbing. The front of the sweater is also a plain rectangle with a cutout for the neck, with ribbing. And the sleeves are a trapezoid with ribbing. So this is how you knit a sweater like this. And the size I'm going to knit is about 25 centimeters in width and about 25 centimeters in height. For the neck I'm going to make an opening of 11 centimeters and 5 centimeters down. And for the sleeve I'm going to use 20 centimeters. And the sleeve is folded in half and attached to the body. Now, in my test swatch I had a gauge on stitch size 6. I had a gauge of 30.5 stitches by 42 rows on a 10 by 10 centimeter square. So this is my gauge. When you have your gauge, you can calculate all these measurements and convert them to the number of stitches you need to knit. Now, a little bit about the cable. I have a schematic of the cable over here. This is a simple cable of 6 stitches crossing 3 over another 3. Don't look at these stitches. This is how you set up your knitting machine. You knit on the front bed, stitch size number 6. Then you take 1 needle out of work, you leave 6 in work for the cable, you take 1 needle out of work and the rest is also in work. On the back bed, which is at half pitch, I can add 2 needles across this 1 needle out of work, same on this side. And this is how you knit your garment. And I've chosen a stitch size of 4.5. This is my first trick. When you decrease the stitch size on the back bed, the stitches on the back bed will be slightly smaller and it's easier to knit the cable, because the stitches won't jump up as much. The next trick is the row before you knit the cable. You add these 2 needles into work, you knit the row before the cable, then you drop these stitches from the machine, creating extra slack, so a little bit of extra yarn on the machine to cross your cables. So these are my 2 tips. But I will show you when I'll knit the garment. So let's go behind the machine. First, knit the back of the sweater. I'm going to start simple. So I'm going to start with the back, which is basically just a rectangle. And I'm not going to knit any cables on the back, so it's a quick win. I'm going to knit 12 rows of 1x1 ribbing, setting up 74 stitches. Then I'm going to reset the row counter, knit up until row 55 and mark the armholes. Then knit up until row 94 and take the remaining work off in 3 parts for 2 shoulders and a neckline on waste yarn. Okay, so first I'm going to rack my beds in full pitch, so the needles are exactly opposite of each other. And I'm going to select 37 stitches to the right side of 0 and 37 stitches to the left side of 0. And all needles in between. Same on the back bed, 37 stitches to the right, 37 stitches to the left and all needles in between. Now I'm going to divide the needles in 1x1 rib division and I'm leaving the outermost needle on the right on the back bed. And I'm leaving the outermost left needle on the front bed. I'm placing my edge springs on the outer needles, making sure that the latches are closed. Now we're set up for 1x1 rib. And now I'm going to set up my locks for knitting. So N for normal knitting, stitch size 1.5, row counter on 0. Same for the back lock, N for normal knitting, stitch size 1.5. And because we're knitting on both beds, a double bed fabric, I'm going to put the orange strippers. I'm selecting my main color yarn. And now I'm going to knit my first zigzag row to cast on. The zigzag row is knitted. And now I'm going to set my front lock to circular knitting C, X. And I'm going to increase the stitch size to 2 3/4. Same for the back lock, C, X for circular knitting, stitch size 2 3/4. And I'm going to knit 1 circular round and that equals 2 circular rows. Now locks to N for normal knitting and I'm going to increase the stitch size to 4. Same for the back lock, N for normal knitting, stitch size to 4. The cast on is complete, so I'm resetting the row counter and now I can knit my 12 rows of ribbing. For my final row of ribbing I like to increase my stitch size to 6, so the ribbing lays nice and flat. Same for the back lock, stitch size to 6. Okay, so now my ribbing is complete and I'm going to transfer all stitches from the back bed to the front. I'm going to remove the edge springs, add all the needles on the front bed, take my double-eyed bodkin tool and I'm going to transfer the stitches from the back to the front bed. And for an easy transfer, I slightly pull on the knitting from below. Okay, all stitches have transferred. I'm replacing the edge springs, making sure that the latches are closed. And now I'm going to set my locks for main knitting. The front lock is set to a stitch size of 6. And for normal knitting, I'm going to reset the row counter. And the back lock goes out of work on G, X, stitch size back to 1. It's not really necessary because it's on GX out of work, but it's just good practice. And because I'm knitting single bed now, I'm going to replace the orange strippers for the black ones. And now I can knit up until row 55 to mark where the armholes need to go. Okay, row 55. So now I'm going to mark where my armholes need to go. And I'm just going to take a little bit of waste yarn, tie a loop, and add that on the outer stitch together with the stitch that's already there. Close the latch, replace the edge spring and just tuck it in between the beds. Same on the other side. Add a piece of waste yarn together on the outer stitch and tuck it in between the beds. And replace the edge spring on the outer needle. Okay, the armholes are marked, so now I'm going to knit up until row 94. Row 94, so I'm done. Now I'm going to divide the work in 3 parts to make the assembly later on easier. So I'm going to put 20 stitches on waste yarn for one shoulder, 34 stitches on waste yarn for the neckline and 20 stitches on waste yarn for the second shoulder. And to do so I'm going to partially knit one piece at a time and I'm going to add the needle pushers. So for all needles that are in work I'm going to add a needle pusher. So now all needles that are in work have a needle pusher, and currently needle pushers are in a resting position. And now I'm going to set my front lock to knit with the needle pushers. That's B, X. Stitch size stays on 6, row counter doesn't matter. I'm selecting the waste yarn. And now I want to knit the first 20 stitches off on waste yarn. So I'm going to put 20 needle pushers in working position. So with my lock on BX, only these needles will knit. And I'm going to knit about 10 rows. And now I'm going to pass the locks without any yarn, so this part will fall from the machine. Okay, first part, knitted off on waste yarn. I'm going to set all these needles out of work. Next part, 34 stitches. So I'm going to activate all these needle pushers. And I'm going to knit these 34 stitches off on waste yarn. These needles can go out of work. And I have 20 needles remaining. I'm going to add the needle pushers. And here is the knitting. Okay, the back of the sweater is finished. Now I'm going to continue with the front of the sweater. Okay, onto the front of the sweater. And now the actual cabling is going to happen. I'm going to start with 74 stitches and I'm going to knit 12 rows in 1 by 1 rib. That's the same as for the back of the sweater, so I'll skip over it pretty quickly and I'll check back in with you when I start with the cabling. Okay, so my ribbing is done and now I'm going to transfer all my stitches from the back bed to the front bed. But I'm not going to transfer all stitches because I'm going to set up for cabling. Which means there is an X amount of needles on the front bed, a needle out of work, then 6 needles for the cable, 1 out of work and an X amount of needles next to the cable. And I have calculated I'm going to have 30 needles, then my cable, 12 needles, then my second cable, 12 needles, my third cable and 30 needles. So I am going to transfer stitches from my back bed to the front, but not all of them. And on top of that I'm also going to add a few stitches. So removing the edge springs, adding all needles on the front bed. Now I'm taking my double-eyed bodkin tool and I'm going to start with 30 needles on the front bed over here. Okay, so 30 needles on the front bed. So this needle with a stitch on it needs to go to the back bed. I want 1 needle extra beside that one, but I also want this needle to be filled with a stitch. So I'm going to pick up a purl bump and put it on the front bed needle. Okay, so now I need 6 needles for my cable. So this needle needs to be empty, which is, and I want an extra stitch on my back bed, so I'm picking up a purl bump from the needle in the front and placing it on the needle on the back. And now I'm going to count 12 needles to the left. Now this needle needs to be transferred to the back bed. Okay, so I'm all set up for cabled knitting. I'm going to rack my bed half a turn clockwise. Now all the pairs of needles on the back bed correspond with one needle out of work on the front bed. I have one cable over here, one cable over here, and one cable over here. I'm replacing the edge springs on the outer needle. And I am removing the edge springs on the back bed. You can put them on these needles, but I find it not really necessary. So I'm all set up for cabling. All needles are in this division. And I'm ready to knit up until row 55, and I'm going to cable every 10 rows. The front lock is set for a stitch size of 6, and for normal knitting I'm going to reset the row counter. The back lock is set to a stitch size of 4.5, and N for normal knitting. And even though we have some needles on the back bed, the majority is on the front, and this is still considered single bed knitting, so I'm going to remove the orange strippers and replace them for the black ones. Now start knitting 8 rows. So I have knitted 8 rows and I'm going to cable on row number 10. So on row number 9 I'm going to add, for each cable, I'm going to add 2 needles on the back bed to pick up a loop on row number 9 for extra yarn, for extra slack to make crossing the cables easier. And these are these 2 needles. So I'm going to add these needles for the middle cable, for the left cable, for the right cable. Now I'm going to take my locks across for row number 9. You can see that the extra needles picked up the yarn. And now I'm going to drop the yarn. And I'm pulling the knitting slightly from below to make it easier for the knitting to slide off the needles. So now we have extra yarn over here. And for row number 10 I'm going to do the cable. I take 2 transfer tools with a 3-prong, because it's a 3 cable by 3, and I'm going to cross 3 stitches with 3 other stitches. So I'll start with the middle cable, it's easiest to see. So I'm going to put my transfer tools on the 6 needles, I'm going to pull up, then I'm going to slightly pull from below, which makes it easier for the yarn to slide over the needles. Now I have all 6 stitches on my transfer tool, and first I'm going to slide to the right, transfer the first 3 stitches to the 3 stitches next to it, like so, very easy. And now I'm going to slide to the left, transferring the final 3 stitches to the 3 stitches next to it, like so. And because of the extra slack in the yarn, it's quite easy to cross the cables. First to the right, then to the left. Same for the final cable. First to the right, then to the left. Now my cables are crossed, and I take my locks across for row number 10. And my cables have knitted. Now after every 8th row you need to add the extra needles, knit those for row number 9 for extra slack on the yarn, then cross the cables and knit the 10th row. Okay, the 8th row again. Add these needles. and I'm releasing the yarn from the extra needles. So now I have extra slack to cross my cables. First to the right, then to the left. Next cable. First to the right, then to the left. All my cables are crossed and my cables have knitted. Now continue with the next 8 rows. Now I'm at row 55, so I'm going to do the same as I did with the back of the sweater. I'm going to mark the place for the armholes. Okay, I have knitted up until row 74. So this means I have to start the shaping for the neckline. And I'm going to put 14 stitches of the machine in the middle. So I'm going to take the middle 14 stitches off the machine. So that's 7 to the left side of 0 and 7 to the right side of 0. First, I'm going to transfer the stitches from the back bed that I used for cabling to the front. I'm taking an extra piece of thread and I'm going to knit off the first stitch. Then I'm going to put it on the adjacent stitch to the left and I'm going to knit it off. 2 stitches decreased. Continue like this. Onto the adjacent stitch, wrap, 3 stitches decreased, final stitch onto the adjacent needle. Now the middle 14 stitches have been knitted off on a separate piece of thread. Now I'm taking my hook and I'm pulling the yarn ends through below. So now I have knitting on the left side and I have knitting on the right side. So I'm going to do partial knitting. First I'm going to knit this side of the knitting and then this side. And I'm going to do so with BX, with the needle pushers. So I'm going to decrease 1 time 3 stitches and knit 2 rows. I'm going to decrease 1 time 3 stitches, knit 3 rows, 1 time 1 stitch, 2 rows, etc. Making cables every 10 rows up until I'm at the shoulder. And then I'm left with 20 stitches. So I'm going to have to put needle pushers into work for all needles into work. I'm not going to knit this part of the knitting, so these needle pushers will all stay out of work. And for these needles, I'm going to add them into work. Except for the 2 needle pushers with the 2 needles that are out of work. Same for the back bed. I have 8 needles left on the back bed. The middle needles are out of work. So these 8 needles also need to get a needle pusher. But, and here comes the important part, also the needles that you use to add slack to the yarn need a needle pusher, otherwise they won't knit. So for these 2 needles I'm putting a needle pusher. For the needles I'm using to add slack, I'm putting a needle pusher, and for these two needles I'm putting a needle pusher. These two needles, the needle pushers are into work, and the extra needles are currently out of work. So this is the setup for the part that I am going to knit. Now onto the other cable. I'm going to add the same pushers, but all the pushers will be out of work because I'm not knitting this part currently. So front lock on B, X, stitch size stays the same. So now my lock knits with the needle pushers. Same for the back lock, B, X, stitch size stays the same. This part is out of work, all needle pushers are out of work, same on the back bed. These needle pushers are in work, same on the back bed. So I'm going to knit this part. Remember the row counter number, row 74, and continue knitting. Now I'm at my 8th row, so I need to add the extra needles for crossing the cable. Watch out! Do not forget to also add the pushers with these extra needles, otherwise they won't knit. So add the extra needles and the extra pushers. Okay, so I am at row 93, so I have one more row to go. And because I want to finish with the clean row, I'm going to transfer the stitches from the back bed to the front. And now my final row for this part of the shoulder. Done. Now I'm going to knit this part off on waste yarn. Now I'm going to switch my attention to the left side. So I'm replacing the edge springs, sliding the trigger for the row counter, replacing the edge spring. And I can do two things. I can continue knitting on BX with the needle pushers, or I can just take all the needle pushers out of work and continue knitting as normal. And because I don't want to remember all the time if I have to put a needle pusher into work on my back bed, I'm going to switch to N for normal knitting, and I'm taking all the needle pushers out of work. Front lock N for normal knitting, stitch size stays on 6, same on the back lock. N for normal knitting, stitch size stays on 4.5, and I'm going to turn back my row counter to row 74. So row 74, that's where I started the right part of the shoulder, and now I'm going to start the left part of the shoulder also on row 74. Taking all the needle pushers out of work. So basically I did not even use these. Same on the front bed, taking them all out of work. So I didn't even use these. Now I'm all set up for knitting again on normal knitting. So continue from row 74 the same way as I did the other shoulder, only mirrored. And here is the front of the baby sweater with the cables. The front of the sweater is now finished, and it was really paying attention. After every 8th row, so knitting on the 9th row preparing for cabling, creating extra yarn, extra slack to make crossing of the cables easier, and also at the same time paying attention to shaping the neckline. But it all worked out great and my front is finished. So next step is knitting 2 sleeves. Starting with 46 stitches, knitting 12 rows of ribbing, increasing 5 times 1 stitch every 10 row, making one final increase, and when I'm at row 59 I should be left with 58 stitches. And then my sleeve is finished and I knit another one. But it's basically all the same. So knitting ribbing, knitting just stockinette, increasing. So I'll go over it pretty quickly. and the first sleeve and the second sleeve on waste yarn. Now the sleeves are finished. Next step is knitting the neckband. And I need 55 stitches for the front neckband and I need 33 stitches for the back neckband. And then I can easily divide it in half to mark where the centers are. So I'm selecting 55 needles to the right side of 0 and 33 stitches to the left side of 0. And all needles in between. Same on the back bed. So all stitches have transferred to the front bed, 55 to the right side of 0, 33 to the left side of 0. And now I'm going to mark the places for my neckline. And I've got a piece of yarn that I've got left over from another project. So I'm taking some of the yarn, I'm just tying a knot. And I want to mark around 0, so one of the 1 needles. And I'm just going to hang the stitch together with the existing stitch on the needle. I also want to mark the middle of my front neckline, so half of 55 is, well, about 27, so 25, 26, 27, so on this needle. It isn't too precise. Adding the yarn on the needle together with the existing stitch, and half of the back neckline, 33, is about 16 or 17, doesn't really matter. Okay, so now I'm pushing the yarn down so it will knit together with the existing stitches, and now the places for my neckline are marked. And now I'm going to knit my neckline off on waste yarn. And here is the ribbing for the neckline with the marked stitches. The middle 0, the 1 needle, is one of the side seams. This is center back, center front, and both ends are another side seam. So now it's very easy to divide the neckline when I sew it onto the sweater. Okay, all parts of my baby sweater are now finished, so next step is sewing it all together. And I can sew it together on a linking machine. I can sew it together by hand with a needle and thread, or I can crochet it together. But today I feel like sewing it together by hand with a needle and thread. So let's do that. Okay, so here are all the pieces for my baby sweater. With, let's be honest, the cabling is really cute. So the back part of the sweater, the front part of the sweater, 1 sleeve, 2nd sleeve, and the neckline. And the baby sweater is finished. And the baby sweater is finished. And I've used this baby sweater to show you how I knit cables on my Passap Duomatic double bed knitting machine. And I've chosen to knit the baby sweater in blue. And that's because I had some blue yarn left. And I chose to knit the baby sweater with a simple cable to show you how I knit cables on my double bed knitting machine. This sweater has bigger cables. You can knit anything you like, but start simple. Start simple, start basic, get the hang of it, and go from there. And before you know it, you'll be knitting cabled sweaters with intricate cable design. And I just love it. It's a great way of spicing up a sweater. It does require a lot of hand manipulation, so it is quite some work, but the results are well worth it. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Maybe knit a cabled sweater for yourself or for someone else. Please leave a like on this video, write a comment in the comments below, subscribe to my channel, you know the drill, it all helps out the channel a lot. Thanks. I wish you happy knitting and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!